Today's topic is a conversation on municipal assets and how to use public assets in wealth building. And first, I want to address the elephant in the room. It sort of has a bad connotation in the United States. Most of it's been tarnished by the experience of Robert Moses in New York City, and what he did with his renewal agencies. But it is fairly common to find cities using municipal assets in either a cooperative model or a model, in this case, this is in Seattle, where they hold it as a ground lease and earn revenue of a building on top of it. These may appear more sophisticated than they are, but they're fairly simple to do if you just reframe your mindset on how you look at public land and community infrastructure in your community. We were asked in Salt Lake City to maybe just run a number on what would be the totality of the county might have in public assets. And we were asked by, at the time, he was the mayor of the county, Ben McAdams, and he had seen one of Mr. Dutter's presentations on public wealth. So he asked the question, well, what are we worth outside of the development that we have in our community? So this is a value per acre model that we did, but this is the private sector side. And you'll notice all the gray on the model is non-taxable stuff. There's a tremendous amount of land that's non-taxable, and you can filter through it. And there are some sacred properties like the steep slopes in their case, and the size of the mountains that you don't want to build on. But there's also assets that are hiding in plain sight that could be and should be measured. So the easiest way we look at it is, do you have something next to a public investment, like let's say a train line? So around the train lines, and they have an extensive train network in Salt Lake, we just measured the real estate within a walkable pedestrian shed around the train stations and measured their value. So the value inside those little pods takes up about 3% of the land area of the county, is producing 11% of the taxable value, which is a pretty strong 1-to-4 ratio of footprint to financial potency. We then modeled that, what it looks like. These are all the public lands, and we're talking city, county, state, school, university. In this case, there's the University of Utah right here. And you can see the boundary lines of all these different municipalities. So even though they're different, they're different structures, they're different forms of government, they're still all in the same county. So they're all cooperatively in the same county. So you're not going to go and redevelop the whole university, but you may chisel off a piece of the university. And we just took as a sample a couple parcels as some cooperative development that could be housing for students that was paying taxes and not a non-taxable situation. It could have been art studios. It doesn't matter. It's just about how do you find opportunities to fit within the cracks of real estate, and what does it mean? What problems can you solve? And to give them a number, we showed them that just on these parcels that you see here, you could house 39,000 new jobs, 24,000 new dwelling units, and they're in a housing crunch out there, which would house 58,000 people, but also produce about $13.5 billion of tax value, which means that you're getting taxes on top of that on an asset that you already own. So it moves from non-taxable to taxable for a temporary basis. It might be 99 years, 70 years, whatever, but it's just giving a number. So overall, over the whole county, what we were able to filter out was about $45 billion worth of new opportunity in the community, which is quite sizable. That's a tremendous amount of revenue. On top of that, that would be tax gains, but also you can solve community goals. To put it in scale, and this is after we filtered off the larger steep slopes or City Hall. You're not going to sell City Hall or the main library downtown, but this is all the public land that was left in blue. In black are the buildings that are currently sitting on all of that blue territory. So we just filled in this rust area here, about 4.3 square miles of new properties, and that would get you your 45 billion. So it's not a lot of real estate when you look at it in the totality of the county. Or another way of looking at it is, here's the total county's current value of taxable value, and you're adding on to it about 45 billion in new opportunity. So with that, that's like the broader picture of how we handled it at Urban 3, but this is more cartoonish, I would say, than what we're about to hear. So I want to introduce two very special guests, and I'm going to start with, I'm going to introduce both of them and then turn the show over to them. So first I want to start with Doug Detter, who advises public and private clients across the world to unlocking the value of public assets. He's worked in over 30 countries on a permanent and project basis and served as a non-executive director of both listed and private companies. He's the author of Public Wealth of Nations, that The Economist and Financial Times has listed as the best book of the year, as well as The Public Wealth of Cities, which I have right here in front of me, and writes regularly on international media. Following Dag's presentation on how this all works at a larger level and many worldwide examples will be Rachel Goldsmith, who is an urban planner and also a former classmate of mine and really good friend, who's worked in public agencies for over 20 years to help determine what they own and how they use it, and how to think strategically about disposition and development of land to increase agency revenue. She specializes in creating GIS for real estate inventories and record management, site selection for specific projects, and identification of surplus land and public inquiries and response and operation applications. And Rachel's largest project has been working with the Transit Authority in Boston, commonly known as the T in Boston. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Dag, and then I'm going to go on mute and we'll see you later. So with that, Dag, if you want to take it away, it's all yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to, it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm going to show my technical ability by sharing my screen. Yes, there we go. Is that working? Good.
Yep, you got it. You're good.
Thank you very much for coming and listening to us. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the way I see how you can use your public assets in a local government, or this could be done on every level, from a local government to a district and a county and state level, even on national level, of course. We're going to stick with the local level here. So, yeah, right. We've got a huge challenge to fund a lot of investments. First of all, we have a backlog of investments that we have been discussing for decades how to pay for. On top of that, we have a climate risk transition that needs to be funded, but we also have a mitigation of climate risk in order to protect ourselves to what the climate change is doing to our world. So the demand for funding, I make a difference between funding and financing. Financing, I think, is, literally is the debt, but funding is how to pay for this, which is usually taxes or user fees. So that's going to come from somewhere, either user fees or taxes. Now, what I'm proposing is that there is an alternative, and that is public assets that we all own. And in the US, that is at least 46 or even more trillion dollars. And the most conservative number, what we could get out of this, if we manage these assets more professionally, is at least some 690 billion or more. I think a lot more, but let's be conservative. Why can we do this? Well, we have these public assets, and they are both real estate and operational assets. So real estate, every city, as Joe and his team has showed and demonstrated very well, owned a lot of real estate assets. And when you talk to a mayor or a county official, they say, well, we have a few assets, but it's not really much, because the accounts doesn't show much. But the reality is that every city owns real estate assets that are bigger than the economic turnover of that city, the economic activity, sorry. And it's usually more than half of the real estate market. So the biggest owner of real estate in every American city is always the public sector. This may not come as a surprise to many people, but if you look at the accounts, there is very little real estate in those accounts. And the reason is the accounting system does not provide any guidance. So what's in the accounts can be sometimes 70 times, what's in the real life can sometimes be 70 times or several hundred times what's in the accounts. So this is an untapped potential. professionally manage these real estate portfolios, first of all, because that's the biggest part of this biggest segment of this portfolio, of public assets portfolio. If they're used and managed professionally, they could provide an income to the government and to the people instead of taxes. The operational assets is what we defined as transportation assets, airports, ports, subways, bus companies, etc. And then utilities, especially in the US, we have water companies that need a lot of maintenance and has a backlog of investments that are badly needed, and this could pay for it. Now, we're coming back to, we can't avoid the wonderful question about accounting in the US, or anywhere actually, which is GASB. And because they don't record assets and liabilities, and most, very famously, pension liabilities are not in there, this causes a problem. Because if an asset is not in the financial statements, what is not measured will not get done, will never be managed, and will not get the care and love that they need in terms of maintenance and investments. So this is a huge problem that we can talk a lot about. But in order to, instead of waiting for some kind of big accounting revolution in the public sector, we can instead package these assets inside a public wealth fund or an urban wealth fund, which is basically a holding company. And we have experimented around the world and in the US for about 100 years and come up with the best practice for by far is the holding company, because we want this, if we want to manage them commercially, we want them to be inside a vehicle that looks as much as possible as the private sector. And there are some wonderful international examples. On the national level, we have Sweden, which I myself managed for a couple of years to turn around this portfolio in order to get Sweden out of a near bankruptcy experience. And we managed to do this with both the real estate and the operational assets, the corporation. Singapore was once, believe it or not, a very, very poor little country. It was basically a garrison town at the tip of Malaysia. And it didn't have even electricity or food or anything to sustain themselves. They moved from a developing country to a developed economy in one single generation. Part of it was that they used their assets that the government owned in a very professional way, separated from day-to-day politics, and into a holding company, a national wealth fund called Temasek. Lots of countries have done this in both Asia and Europe for over a century and have succeeded very well. We have some cities that has done this extremely well, like Copenhagen, who developed the harbor that was no longer used in the same way, because as the container developed, that shifted, you needed completely different resources. So the harbor in many cities stood basically deserted. So that was 5 square kilometers that was then developed into more than 30,000 residential units and 100,000 workspaces, universities, schools, kindergartens, everything you can think of. And it even was so profitable, so it could pay for the extension of the subway. Hamburg did something similar with half the size of its harbor, and they managed to pay for all these things: universities, public housing, workspaces, and a state-of-the-art concert hall, which is basically the Eiffel Tower of Hamburg. It's become a real monument of that city. And all these cases are without spending one tax dollar. Another segment which is very popular is transportation side, which I'm sure Rachel is going to talk a lot about, and Joe mentioned in the beginning here, because transportation companies like railways, etc., own a lot of land on top of the station or around the stations. And this is what we did in Sweden, and managed to pay for the doubling of the railway volume in Sweden, and also the capacity of the subway in Stockholm. And we created an innovation district, which was which has become the Silicon Valley of Europe, and without one tax dollar, all paid by making a public wealth fund and an urban wealth fund that developed this. Instead of privatizing it, they developed it and generated an income. UK Rail has done the same thing, that paid for part of the Olympic Games. Hong Kong is probably the most famous example. They built a subway which is better than anyone you can imagine. And it's the size of New York City. And they built this without one tax dollar. Extremely efficient, and also today at very low cost, because they're still making money of all the commercial developments they generated. So what this means is this is a supplement or even a replacement for taxes, because every dollar you make from managing your assets is something that can be saved from budgetary cuts or tax increases. So it's quite timely in these days. And the beginning of everything is a feasibility study that you can call an asset map, which is brilliantly done, as you have seen in this example, by Urban 3 and Joe and his team. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Rachel. Rachel, if you could take control of the screen, and it's all yours.
Sure. Okay, can you see my
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Yep, you're up.
Great. So I'm going to talk about sort of a case study of what Doug has been talking about generally here. I work with the MBTA in Massachusetts, which is commonly referred to as the T. It's the Public Transit Authority in the state. And the agency has had a long history of kind of inefficiency. And in the 80s, the Secretary of Transportation in Massachusetts ended up in prison for bribery. In the kind of apocryphal story of how my work got started was that the T had started eminent domain proceedings against a piece of property that it turned out they already owned, and it got in the papers, and just, you know, look, there's a public perception that things weren't being handled very well, and I think that was probably correct. The MBTA used to go to the state legislature every year and basically hand them a bill and say, here's what we spent this year, this is how much money we need. In the 90s, they passed something called forward funding in Massachusetts, which gave the T a penny out of the 5 cents sales tax, but also required that they balance their budget, and kind of gave them a little bit more responsibility for financial accountability. So you've kind of got this background of deferred maintenance and an asset. Their real estate, they're the second largest landowner in the state, not being really managed very well. So along comes Governor Weld, who was governor of Massachusetts from 1991 till 97. And he initiated a privatization campaign in the state. And among the services that were privatized was the MBTA's real estate department. So the first company that got the contract to do this was called TRA. And I actually went to work with them right after Joe and I left grad school. They had the contract for about 17 years, and then it was turned over to a new vendor, which is called Mass Realty Group. It's a joint venture of Greystone and JLL. There's always big alphabet soup with these things, but I work with them now, and we've been working on it since 2014. So this private company becomes the MBTA's representative in real estate matters, and really we start trying to see their real estate holdings as an asset and treat them as such. We have earned over $500 million in revenue just on the MBTA side. And we've actually started in the last couple of years also working with MassDOT assets. So working with the DOT in Massachusetts as well. They've got just as interesting a portfolio as the MBTA does. So I'm just going to quickly show you a few examples of projects that we've done, just to kind of give, I think there was a question about, what are some examples of projects, just to give a kind of a broad stroke of the different kinds of things that have been done with the T's real estate. The Back Bay Station deal up on the upper left-hand corner is actually a long-term lease of air rights of the station, combined with a lease of, there's a MassDOT parking garage adjacent to this parcel. So it creates a site where an actual, probably skyscraper will be built over the next couple of years. Ashmont Station, this is a development, a TOD at the end of the red line, where we used an 85-year ground lease. It resulted in 116 units of housing and some commercial retail space and some parking spots. This is at the end of the line, so they were especially in need of parking. 225 Amory was a sale, just flat out sold the parcel. This is on the orange line in Roxbury, Jamaica Plain area. And the T ended up with a $1 million plus upfront payment off of the sale of this parcel. There is, of course, a good number of TOD projects that have been done. This was one of the first ones that we did with TRA. It's at the almost end of the green line. It's the second to last stop on the green line in Newton. And it's a 40B transit-oriented development in Massachusetts. If you're from Massachusetts, you know that if your city or town doesn't meet a certain threshold for affordable housing, developers can bypass the zoning, planning and zoning process in your town and build kind of something that might not have gotten through that process otherwise. So this ended up being a pretty nice looking 40B. It was 25% affordable. This was also done with an 85-year ground lease. This is a new station in the Allston-Brighton area of Boston. And the cool and important thing about this is the T got a brand new station out of this on our commuter rail line. The New Balance, which is a company that's based in Boston, was building a new corporate headquarters and office space. And we got the project to start out, here's their idea for their office space. It ends up looking like this with a brand new T station. So it's another way that you're thinking about increasing revenues for your agency. You're also thinking about decreasing operational and maintenance costs and decreasing capital expenses and things like that. The T got a brand new station out of this deal. And it's really kind of changing the nature of this whole little area where it was built. Another part of, or I should say, the privatization effort included just dispositions. So all acquisitions of property are still done in-house at the MBTA. Typically, when the T is acquiring land, it's for a specific construction or expansion project. So it just still makes the most sense for the T to do their own acquisitions in-house. We do work closely with the acquisitions team, but everything that the private companies have done has really focused on the disposition side. We also manage the MBTA's leasing and licensing. There are over 1,000 tenants who have leases for land, utilities, telecom, wires, pipes, conduits, fiber, advertising, billboards, signs, retail concessions, the Dunkin' Donuts in the station, the push carts in the station, parking. There's also a certain amount of management that goes into some of the long-term leases. The one on the bottom right is a parking garage lease with North Station. And this deal was done in 2011. It's a $75 million deal, and the T got $50 million up front for this. But there's sort of an escrow structure, but there are also milestones and conditions that need to be met along the way, and that's part of what we do as our service to them, is to monitor those kind of like balloon payments or things that happen at certain times that if before it was being managed privately, some of those things would kind of fall off the radar screen. And then on the left here, you've got South Station, which is a really nice part of our system. And actually, the whole station is leased to another company that does all the subleasing for the retail concession spaces. Another thing that we've worked a lot on is billboards and advertising. This top deal in the top left here was actually the sale of a parcel, but the T retained the rights to keep these 2 billboards. So the most lucrative income stream from this old bus turnaround is retained, but the unneeded bus turnaround land was sold, and there are several units of housing being developed there right now. We have been increasingly trying to find spots for outdoor signage. Here's one on the South Station bus garage. Here's one on a vent stack. The last time I walked by this, actually the whole north facing part of the stack had a sign on it. One of our stations, State, was called Citizens Bank Station for a couple of years in the late 90s. I know naming rights aren't the most popular thing all the time, but they can be another source of revenue for the agency. So when I started working on this in the 90s, payphones were the big moneymaker. And eventually people stopped using payphones. Then ATMs became a big income stream for us. So I'm always kind of looking for what's the next thing going to be. We have started doing a lot of vending, like Redbox, and even like fresh food vending has started to become popular in some of the stations. This was before the pandemic, but I'm expecting that it's probably going to come back. They set up a refrigerated machine and they come by and fill it every morning. You can get smoothies and bowls and things like that. But interestingly, another thing that's happened is ATMs have come back more almost as an advertising way for a company to establish a presence in a new market. So we did an RFP. There's a really great, talented guy in our office who put this all together this past year for ATMs in the stations, and Chase responded. And Chase Bank is trying to break into the Northeast market. So these, yes, they function as ATMs, but they also serve as these kind of little lit up advertising billboards for them in the stations to increase their public presence. And then of course, we've also got fiber conduits along all of our transit and commuter rail lines. We work on retail concessions. Here's a couple of examples: push cart vendors in the stations. We somehow also permit the subway performers, which isn't a big money maker, but it's something that's kind of fun. We have them come and play at our holiday party every year. Other initiatives we've been working on, we do power purchase agreements for, there are a bunch of commuter rail stations that are getting solar. We take requests for movies to be made. This is something that our licensing department has really started working on over the last couple of years. This is from Defending Jacob, which was an Apple production. And this is a Netflix movie that was just filmed here this past year. So we have like a special licensing process that the studios go through to be able to work in the stations. We're also looking at abandoned tunnels. This is under City Hall Plaza. I've actually been doing a studio this year, looking at an abandoned tunnel in Brattle Square, adjacent to Harvard Square. These are old underground areas, but they're also, thousands of square feet of potential retail or other space in areas where you just don't find open spaces like that anymore. We did a deal about 15 years ago to get all new bus shelters. And the shelters were ultimately paid for by the advertising on the shelter. So we've got wayfinding, we've got seating. In other cases, there's some street furniture that goes along with these. But that was an amenity. That was something that the T would have had to pay for, that we ended up getting someone else to pay for instead. So a big part of this, and I'm not going to really get in detail on this at all, but we did a very thorough real estate inventory. It's really hard to manage your property as an asset if you don't know what it is. And we mapped over 4,000 parcels and entered all the title documentation into this web-based application that's got about 1,000 users. And this is something that the MBTA uses every single day, whether it's an attorney looking for title information or the police trying to figure out if they're responsible for towing a car, or operations or maintenance, just trying to figure out if they need to go move a fallen tree or mow a lot or clean something up. This has been a great tool for them to use. So just in the last minute, just a couple quick points. The privatization was controversial. It was something that came down from the top. Governor Weld really had this privatization effort that he wanted to do with the state hospitals and prisons. And, we can talk more about it if people are interested. I'm not a pro privatization across the board, and I don't necessarily think that that's the best solution. I definitely think it's the wrong thing to do in certain cases. But in this case, taking this piece out of the MBTA, out of the transit authority, and subjecting it to the private sector profit motive has been really successful for them. So TRA and MRG are both private companies, but they still operate within both the public bidding process, which is a legislatively mandated process that every parcel gets appraised, and there's a sealed bid process. There's a whole process that we go through that you wouldn't really go through on just the private sector side, to make sure that there's no favoritism or corruption or anything like that. We also canvass all of the proposed sales, easements, leases. All of the deals go through the operational departments at the MBTA. They need to sign off on them. So that is really where you see kind of what I see as a healthy tension between the profit motivation of what we're trying to do and what the T's priority is, which is operations. They want to run trains. They want to move people from A to B. That's their number one. That's why they never paid much attention to their real estate. But over the arc of this contract, over the 25 years or so that I've been working with this, I've seen some changes in that relationship, and it's interesting. We can talk more about that if people want to. So that concludes my prepared slides, and very happy to answer questions and have a discussion.
Thanks, Rachel. If you could unshare, and then that'll bring all of us up on the screen. I want to maybe start with, there's been a lot going on the chat, and we'll get to those questions. But first, let's get to some of maybe the bigger overarching questions, and some of which that have come in through when people signed up. But one of I guess you both have touched on this in your presentations, but the frequent response that I get from people is, you just want to sell everything off, or that's the misconception that happens with privatization, with air quotes around it, is the evil thing. How would you respond to that? And I'm going to be able to start with Doug. You're on mute, Doug. Sorry.
Privatization has been the natural reaction for a number of reasons. I mean, one is the accounting doesn't show the real value of the property. So when you are accounting on a cash basis, you have a budget deficit. and you want to plug that deficit, and then you suddenly find a real estate piece that match that value, and you really don't care whether you're maximizing the value at that moment. You just want to plug the deficit, because since you don't have a balance sheet really that is, you're not measured against a balance sheet and a net worth, it doesn't really matter to you. What matters is that you are plugging the deficit, budget deficit. And this has been, one of the reasons why privatization has been so popular. So it's based on, I would say, underdeveloped accounting methods, which would never happen in the private sector, in a corporation, or with a private person. I mean, you wouldn't sell because you're not making, you're having, your costs are higher than your expenses 1 year. You wouldn't sell a second home that you might have, or anything like, or a second car. You would rent it out instead, or try to develop it so you can rent it out for a better fee. And this is what the whole game is about. And the second thing is that governments lack the confidence to say, we can probably set up an entity, an urban wealth, what I call an urban wealth fund, and be as good a developer as anyone in the private sector. There is no, I mean, if you think about it, pension funds who are taking care of the pensions for teachers or other public sector workers, they are investing in private equity, they're investing in private corporations, and they're making money out of that investment. That's not, it's not more strange than that. You have a relationship to something commercial, and you're making money out of it, which pays your pensions. And cities, counties, etc., should do the same, and not just sell at a too low price and at the wrong time of the market just to plug a budget deficit.
So Rachel, I mean, your agency was born of controversy. You've survived through this exactly with this tension of what do you sell or how do you rent it? And I think Dag raises an interesting point that, and you see this with the Airbnb and VRBO markets, where people have a second home and they're just renting it while they're not there. They don't sell the house. So how would you respond to that?
I guess I'm not pro privatization across the board. And I think that, different agencies, different municipalities or authorities, or, everybody's got a slightly different situation. In our case, it really made sense to take this piece of the authority's operations outside the agency, to distance from the sort of perceptions and reality of, just a not really well functioning system, but also to introduce the private sector profit motive, which was not there before. And that, that's kind of started out as, well, let's do an audit of all the leases. And some of these leases were 100 years old. They were handwritten for $1 a year. There was a blacksmith shop, literally still a working blacksmith shop, set up with no windows, in the abutments in the side of the right of way. So there were all these kind of like low-hanging fruit, like unused rail yard, unused bus garage right in the city, a couple acres. That was those were all the first things to go. And sometimes it does make sense to sell it, but we've done a lot of long-term leases, air rights deals, easements, looking for kind of mining. We're always mining the inventory. We found places where we have old spur rights that divide someone's parcel or go through 2 parcels. And if we let people buy us out of our spur easement that we're not using anymore, consolidate a parcel, and that becomes a parcel for development. So some of it is sales, but there's a whole lot of other work you can do. Even if you said you weren't going to sell anything, there's still so much you can do with an inventory like this.
So Amanda, my takeaway from both your presentations is that the word profit is maybe a skewed word for a lot of folks, that this isn't necessarily a profit motive. You wouldn't say that if an orphanage needed to stay in business, that the orphanage was profit motivated if it was trying to pay rent, right? It's actually trying to keep itself going. And the same can be true of public assets, that it's not about squandering those assets, but about building, back to Dog's comment, building public wealth with assets that you have in a way that's more productive for the whole entire community and making it a conscious choice. But I want to go back to, we our conversation that we had in prep for this presentation, and and Dog, you raised a great point about Gatsby, which relies on our general accounting principles and the failure of accounting. And one of the ways that you talked about it was accounting of cash flow basis versus accrual basis. Could you maybe expand upon that for the audience about the difference between cash basis and accrual basis?
Yeah. Cash is just like what you get in the mail, if you get mail, or on your computer, from what's recorded on your bank account. It shows cash coming in, cash coming out. If accrual doesn't record just the cash coming in and coming out, it records every transaction that occurs. So if I am a small government and I have had taxes coming in at $100 millions, and then 75 is paid cash and 25 is paid is not paid up front, but is a liability, then that is shown in an accrual, in a cash basis. The 25 disappears, but in accrual accounting, that is put in the liabilities and as an asset. And same thing if you have if you have promised your public sector workers you're going to pay a pension when they retire in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, that doesn't show up in cash accounting. Just like in your bank account, it doesn't show up. But in accrual accounting, every transaction shows up that has an impact on your finances. Same thing with assets. If you have an asset and you sell it, that's going to give you cash into your, so that's going to suddenly give a boost to your cash, and you're able to pay down the debt, which is going to make you look very good as a politician or as a bureaucrat. But in reality, if you instead think of yourself as a balance sheet where you measure the net worth, in other words, assets minus liabilities, your net worth is less if you have sold off an asset and paid off the debt. It's untouched. But with cash accounting, that is incentivized, which means that selling assets and paying down debt in cash accounting, that is incentivized. But with accrual accounting, it would be more, you would be incentivized to instead say, well, this water pipes have not been maintained for 100 years. We have a lot of lead. We should invest and replace the lead with proper copper or whatever we want. And we should do some maintenance on our bridges. That would increase the value. In other words, increase the net worth of our balance sheet. And I would look good. If I'm a manager of a corporation, that would make me look, I'm prudent. I have not squandered my assets. But if you have cash accounting, that will never show. It will just show that, yes, you have sold off some assets at whatever price. It doesn't matter. Nobody knows if it's the right mark because you don't mark to market your assets. So cash accounting is set up for waste and incentivizing selling off assets, not doing maintenance, and not doing investments. And this is critical.
And it's a huge point. In fact, there's a video that we have on our YouTube channel. If anybody wants to look at it, we did an entire show on the Gatsby and the failure of it. The simple way I get my brain around it is cash basis is kind of like owning a restaurant and running a restaurant, and you're just looking in the till at the end of the night and saying, do we have money? Yes or no? And that's how you're gauging your business without understanding that that building that you own, that you're running that restaurant out of, needs an air conditioner fixed. It needs new carpeting. It needs the windows fixed. That's the accrual side of seeing all of those losses. That's how I get my brain around it. Now, one of the other questions that we talked about is this firewall of how do you ensure that you're having a good communication between the public entity and this, let's call it a quasi-private entity that's making these decisions. So I'll start with Rachel on this one. Rachel, what have you learned in your experience of this dance that you have to do with the public entity that is basically the holder of the asset, and how it gets functioned with the wealth side?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've had several different kind of client managers on the agency side over the years, and their priority is always transportation. Their mission is to move trains from one place to another and to get commuters into the city and out of the city. And I've always found it to be sort of a healthy kind of push back and forth, that our agency, our company wants to make money, and the T wants to make sure that they can still access the track. There are a lot of deals that we propose that get rejected, and I think it just takes having those two strong forces. And whether it's a private company, I think what Doug said is exactly right with the cash versus accrual accounting. That's exactly what happens. Maintenance gets deferred. You can see, a train pulls into the station, it's just crumbling, and it's just, sometimes they get really bad. The bridges and tunnels, these are things that, with the kind of the 4-year political cycle that we have, makes people short-sighted. But I think having those two strong forces of transportation mission and profit motivation, which again, I'll just frame that in terms of what you were saying. No one person's getting rich off this. Like, we're just trying to be able to get new Orange Line trains and reinforce the bridges that people drive on.
And Doug, what are some successful examples that you could share with the audience about how that, who's doing? I mean, you've mentioned several examples. Would you say go straight to Singapore for this? Like, what's the best examples that you've seen on negotiating that?
I mean, first of all, when you're trying to make big changes, having the right words matter. So I would really try to avoid calling the holding company what I call an urban wealth fund. I like that word because it feels civic, it feels public minded, and when you call it a private entity, that feels like you're halfway to privatize this stuff, and that's exactly what we don't. What we don't want to do. I mean, we are not privatizing this. We're trying to make money out of this in a professional way with proper accounting, so that the maintenance gets done, the investments gets done, and that we get some profit over it that we can use for other stuff. I mean, we have examples where these companies have paid for public housing. They have paid for all kinds of things. If you run it correctly, there will be a profit and that you can use for public benefits, for public housing, affordable housing, or whatever you need. But it's a public wealth fund. It's not a private fund, but we will hire people, the best people. If they come from the private sector, that's fine, which they probably will. But the owner, I mean, I think you have Green Bay Packers, right? It's a football team like every other, but it's owned by a government entity. I mean, they're not, you don't look down on them, you don't mind if they win. You want them to win. So, I mean, this is the same thing. You don't want these guys to go out there and lose some money, guys. That's not the point. You want them to win. You want them to build beautiful houses. You want them to trains to run brilliantly and be maintained and be sharp. So that's very important. But it's also very important that whatever you put in the urban welfare are real commercial assets. It's not the asset that needs a subsidy. So it's not the parks. It's not the town city hall or something like that that needs taxes to go around. That shouldn't be paid through commercial rates. And then that you have the incentive system so that they work differently. And you need to market this, because the urban welfare will be paid market rates for their salaries and incentives. And you need to make sure that people understand they're also taking a risk, because if they fail, they will be kicked out. They don't have any job security and really make that understood. But also you need to make a PR drive that, listen, this year they had a dividend that actually we used to pay for this school, to maintain this school. You need to show that, the money they're making and how commercial they are, how professional they are, when they've scored their goals, is for the benefit of society as a whole. That is very important.
Well, actually, excellent points. Great use of the Packers, by the way, and that's spot on. It's a one of the points that you raised with this is that holding the agency accountable. I think it was the last lab that we had, or maybe, actually it was the last lab that we had was with the Rochester, Minnesota Destination Medical Center, which is essentially a business improvement district in the downtown, but they have to do a 5-year report and show how their investments have worked, what kind of public benefit has been produced. This is really, it's just holding an agency accountable and ensuring that public goals are met by an agency that works on their behalf. So that's something that oftentimes our own habits in government of, we've never done this before, so it's so difficult, is a misnomer, and it's sort of a cop-out. We're coming around in the last 5 minutes. I want to go ahead and open it up to the questions on the from the chat room, and ask Kate if she can hop in with any immediate questions. I've been engaged here.
A great question from Jonathan Ferry, which Doug kind of touched on in his most recent answer. But what he asks is, in St. Louis, the city there owns about 50% of the land, but it falls into 3 categories, which are roads and right-of-ways, parks, and then small non-contiguous urban parcels in severely blighted neighborhoods. And they really want to develop those properties in category 3, but to do so, they need resources to assemble enough parcels to make them contiguous. And so without all that scale, the market's too weak in those areas to help attract private investors. Do you have any recommendations for the city in that situation?
I think Rachel probably knows this situation much better because it's typical American, but typically what I would say is, usually when you've done an asset map like this, you probably haven't caught everything, because you need to look at the whole group structure. I mean, if you think about this as a corporation, if you think of the city, or I call it, don't think about the city as a corporation. Think of the city as a geographical space. So in that geographical space, you will have lots of owners. You will probably have 100 or maybe 1,000 special districts. You will have the city, you will have the county. In Boston, you have the Commonwealth, and you will have the state, and you will have the federal government. And you have to look at everybody and think of the public real estate ownership, because it doesn't matter what level of government owns this. And then it's easier to get contiguous, I would think, pieces of land, so that you may not have the harbor like Boston or Copenhagen or Hamburg. You may not have an old airport or something like that, but you will have other places. I mean, the luckiest one are the ones with some kind of waterfront, because there's always been a place for an old factory, etc. That's the kind of places you want to look at. But the more levels of government you include, that's how you. That's one way of doing this, because then you you will get a bigger picture. Rachel, I think you probably have more to say about this.
I think that's right. You know, sometimes there are opportunities for parcel consolidation that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. If you look at doing land swaps, or I don't know the parcels or how big they are, maybe not all of them are going to work. Maybe some of them do get sold so someone else can consolidate something, and you use that money to work in another area.
And I'm gonna just throw in one more, maybe a local example here in Asheville. But there was a highway project that's still going on in our community, but a group of us got together and basically altered the design just by nudging some things around. And we ended up harvesting 100 acres of land right next to downtown, which translates into let's call it $800 million worth of development opportunity on land that's currently non-taxable. And that's all that takes to do that type of project, is a coordination between the state highway department, the city, and the county. It would be that simple. We have three governments. There's the land. That's the opportunity. So you can actually, if you take an entrepreneurial mindset and a creative design mindset, you can find space throughout the whole city. Back to Doc's comment of seeing the whole municipality in total is a community by design.
And I'll just add that one of our clients, City of South Bend, Indiana, developed a revolving loan fund for some neighborhoods like the ones you're describing. And, you know, the city had city-owned parcels, and they helped folks develop those parcels, and additionally provided pre-approved building plans for different style housing for those parcels.
Yeah, that's pretty.
It's just, well, the mindset of the government wants to solve the problem, and the problem is the most impoverished neighborhood or the floodplain. And that's not going to work until you have a revenue source that can compensate for that. So it's an and problem, not a but-for problem. Was there another question? We got one more minute here, Kate. Is there another question on the board?
Yeah, you already touched on it briefly, but just, you know, why do you need to have a holding company to manage these assets? Is there an actual legal reason, or, you know, can you dispense of property on a property by property basis as just a public entity?
No, that doesn't work. I mean, I've tried this so many times, it doesn't work. Because if you do it in a public agency, partly because of the accounting, you're always going to be forced to sell rather than to develop and do the maintenance and do the investments. So you're going to sell parking areas, instead of seeing the parking area as we can do a mixed use development and fivefold the number of parking spaces and the revenues for parking in a garage in the basement, and then make money out of the mixed use development and increase the value so that the balance sheet of the city will improve, which means that we will have a better debt sustainability and a financial we think in net worth rather than and just in cash terms. So that's one way. But the other thing is a government cannot manage commercial risk. So if you do it in an agency, you will always sell either the land as such or the leasing right, which is you're short shifting the taxpayer and yourself. What you want to do is to create a commercial entity that actually will do what otherwise the private sector does, to develop it, to build the house, to build the garage that, you know, tenfolds the garage spaces and creates public housing, creates offices, etc., and make money out of it. I'm sorry, I'm using this dirty word, but you know, that money is going to pay for affordable housing, it's going to pay for schools, it's going to pay for a lot of things. It's not dirty, it's wonderful. It's instead of taxes. And so without that holding company, which has to be a holding company, because that's how you manage commercial risk. That's how the private sector has developed all these risk management and value management techniques for 800 years. We need to learn from them. And that's why you need the holding company, not an agency, because you want to be able to capture that value instead of giving it away to the private sector. This is the whole essence.
What we've done in Massachusetts would never have happened if the agency had been tasked with doing it. I think if public agencies could do this, they would. And some of them do on a small scale. but this isn't a secret. It just, you know, we don't have time to, I guess, go into the whole thing, but it doesn't happen within the constraints on this scale, within the constraints of a public agency.
I want to thank you both. We're at time. This has been a great conversation. We're going to go ahead and capture everybody else's questions that are on here that we missed, and we'll try to respond with an email. This is being recorded. The next session is the last Thursday of May, and our topic is probably going to be about the assessment methodologies in Buncombe County and what we're discovering with our reassessments. So stay tuned to that one. That'll be interesting. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us. And I want to thank you all for your time and thank our presenters. Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Rachel. This has been great.
Thank you, Rachel.
So thanks,
Okay.
Doc.